Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Critics and Controversies in Environmental Discourse Analysis. Environmental discourse analysis is not without its critics and controversies. Major points of contention include the anthropocentrism prevalent in environmental discourse, the perceived lack of political engagement in discourse analysis, and the inherent limitations of language in accurately representing ecological realities. 1. Anthropocentrism in discourse. Anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, is a worldview that places humans at the center of concern and value, often to the detriment of non-human life forms and ecosystems. This perspective has been widely criticized in environmental discourse analysis, with critics arguing that it marginalizes non-human concerns and leads to unsustainable environmental practices. 1. Key critiques of anthropocentrism in environmental discourse. Marginalization of non-human entities. Critics argue that anthropocentric discourse prioritizes human needs and desires, often ignoring or undervaluing the rights and intrinsic worth of non-human entities like animals, plants, and ecosystems. Economic dominance. Many environmental discourses focus on economic growth and human development, framing nature as a resource to be exploited. This narrative often neglects the long-term environmental impacts of such exploitation. Instrumental view of nature. Anthropocentrism often views nature solely in terms of its utility to humans, such as for resources or recreation. This instrumental view can lead to environmental degradation as the natural world is exploited for short-term human benefit. Ethical concerns. Environmental ethicists argue that anthropocentrism leads to a disregard for the intrinsic value of nature, promoting a utilitarian approach that justifies environmental harm if it benefits humans. Climate change discourse. In climate change discourse, anthropocentrism often results in a focus on human impacts and adaptation measures, sometimes neglecting the effects on wildlife and ecosystems. Biodiversity loss. Anthropocentric discourse can lead to policies that exacerbate biodiversity loss, as decisions prioritize economic or social factors over the protection of species and habitats. 2. Moving toward ecocentrism. In contrast to anthropocentrism, ecocentrism advocates for a worldview that recognizes the intrinsic value of all living beings and ecosystems, emphasizing the interconnectedness of humans and nature. This approach encourages policies and discourses that prioritize ecosystem health, focus on maintaining healthy ecosystems as a priority for sustainability. Promote intrinsic value. Recognize the intrinsic worth of non-human entities, regardless of their usefulness to humans. Encourage holistic thinking. Encourage decision-making that considers the impacts on all species and ecological processes. 3. Implications for environmental discourse analysis. Critical examination of language. Analysts are encouraged to scrutinize the language used in environmental discourse to identify anthropocentric biases that may influence policy and public perception. Advocacy for inclusive discourse. There is a push to include non-human interests in environmental discourse, reflecting a more holistic and equitable view of nature. Shifting policy and public perception. By challenging anthropocentric discourse, environmentalists aim to shift policy and public perception towards more sustainable and inclusive practices. Critics of anthropocentrism in environmental discourse advocate for a paradigm shift toward more ecocentric views, emphasizing the importance of including non-human concerns in environmental conversations to ensure the health and sustainability of our planet. 2. Political neutrality. Critics argue that some forms of environmental discourse analysis lack political engagement, suggesting that the method's emphasis on textual analysis and linguistic interpretation sometimes leads to an insufficient focus on the political implications of environmental issues. Here's a closer look at this critique. 1. Key critiques of political neutrality in environmental discourse analysis. Insufficient focus on political action. Some critics argue that by concentrating primarily on language and discourse, researchers might overlook the need to connect their findings to concrete political action or policy advocacy. Abstract analysis. The focus on linguistic structures and discourse patterns might lead to overly abstract discussions that don't effectively address the political realities of environmental problems, such as lobbying, regulatory frameworks, or corporate influence. Lack of direct advocacy. Critics suggest that discourse analysis can sometimes appear politically neutral or detached, analyzing discourse without advocating for specific political solutions or engaging in direct activism. Disregard for power structures. Some critiques point out that discourse analysis, when not grounded in a political critique, can fail to address the power structures and inequalities that influence environmental policy and practice. Overemphasis on interpretation. The focus on interpretation and deconstruction of language may lead to overemphasis on semantics rather than addressing the practical implications of environmental discourse for policy and decision-making. 2. Arguments in defense of political engagement. Critical discourse analysis. Advocates of critical discourse analysis argue that this approach explicitly addresses power relations and inequalities, thus inherently linking discourse analysis to political issues. Social justice perspective. Some researchers argue for incorporating social justice perspectives into environmental discourse analysis, ensuring that political engagement remains central to the analysis. Application to policy and advocacy. There's an emphasis on translating insights from discourse analysis into policy recommendations and advocacy, making the findings relevant to political action. Highlighting power dynamics. By critically analyzing how environmental discourse reinforces or challenges power dynamics, analysts can emphasize the political implications of their work. 3. Moving forward. To address these critiques, environmental discourse analysis can emphasize policy implications, make a stronger connection between discourse analysis findings and their implications for policy and advocacy. Engage in political critique. Analyze environmental discourse within the context of existing power structures and political dynamics. Collaborate with activists and policymakers. Work closely with activists and policymakers to ensure that research informs real-world action. While discourse analysis is primarily a linguistic tool, it can be employed to uncover the political implications of environmental issues. Researchers can address critiques of political neutrality by ensuring their work actively engages with political realities and informs advocacy and policy change. 3. Language limitations. One of the significant criticisms of environmental discourse analysis revolves around the limitations of language itself in representing the complex realities of ecological systems. Language, being a human construct, can often oversimplify, misrepresent, or inadequately capture the intricate and interconnected nature of ecological realities. Here's a closer look at the specific challenges. 1. Key critiques of language limitations in environmental discourse analysis. Simplification of complexity. Ecological systems are inherently complex, with countless interactions and variables. Language often simplifies these systems into neat categories and narratives, which can obscure their complexity and lead to misunderstandings. Anthropocentric bias. Many languages have developed from an anthropocentric perspective, inherently centering human experience and concerns. This bias can limit how effectively we discuss non-human entities and ecological processes. Metaphors and framing. The metaphors and frames used to describe environmental issues can shape understanding in ways that might not fully capture ecological realities. For example, framing ecosystems as resources can emphasize exploitation over preservation. Abstract terminology. Terms like biodiversity, sustainability, and climate change are abstract and can mean different things to different people. This ambiguity can lead to misunderstandings and different interpretations of environmental issues. Linguistic representation of new concepts. As new environmental phenomena emerge, there can be a lag in developing adequate linguistic representations for them, which can hinder effective communication and policy development. 2. Addressing language limitations in environmental discourse analysis. Interdisciplinary approach. Collaborating with ecologists and scientists can help ensure that discourse analysts accurately understand and represent ecological realities. Expanding linguistic tools. Exploring new metaphors, frames, and terminology that better capture ecological complexity can help enrich environmental discourse. Inclusive perspectives. Incorporating perspectives from diverse cultures and languages can reveal alternative ways of understanding and discussing environmental issues. Critical self-reflection. Analysts should remain aware of language limitations and reflect critically on how language influences the perception and understanding of ecological issues. Visual and non-verbal communication, including visual data, maps, infographics, etc., and non-verbal communication in discourse analysis can complement linguistic analysis and provide a more holistic understanding of ecological realities. Language limitations in environmental discourse analysis highlight the importance of critically evaluating how we talk about the environment. By being mindful of these limitations and adopting more inclusive and accurate ways of representing ecological realities, analysts can enhance the effectiveness and accuracy of environmental discourse. Conclusion. Critiques of environmental discourse analysis highlight the need to address anthropocentrism, enhance political engagement, and overcome language barriers. Addressing these issues is essential for ensuring discourse analysis accurately reflects environmental concerns and drives effective policy change. Frequently asked questions. What is anthropocentrism, and why is it criticized in environmental discourse? Anthropocentrism is the focus on human concerns at the expense of non-human entities in discourse. Critics argue that many environmental discussions are too human-centered, overlooking the needs and rights of non-human species, ecosystems, and ecological processes. How does anthropocentrism manifest in environmental discourse? It manifests through language and narratives that prioritize human interests, often framing environmental issues in terms of their impact on humans rather than on the broader ecosystem. This bias can shape policies and practices that neglect the needs of non-human nature. Why is political neutrality criticized in environmental discourse analysis? Political neutrality is criticized because environmental issues are inherently political. Some argue that failing to take a political stance can lead to superficial analysis that doesn't address the deeper power structures and interests influencing environmental discourse. What challenges arise from the perceived lack of political engagement in environmental discourse analysis? A lack of political engagement can lead to analyses that fail to address the role of politics in shaping environmental narratives. This omission can overlook important power dynamics that influence environmental decision-making. What are the limitations of language in accurately representing ecological realities? Language can be limited in its ability to convey the complexity of ecological systems. The nuanced relationships and dynamics of ecosystems are often simplified or misrepresented, making it challenging to communicate ecological realities effectively. How does anthropocentrism affect policymaking? Anthropocentrism can lead to policies that prioritize human needs, sometimes at the expense of environmental sustainability. It can result in decisions that overlook the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem health. What are some examples of how political neutrality in discourse analysis can impact environmental narratives? A politically neutral analysis might ignore the influence of corporate lobbying on environmental policies or fail to highlight the effects of unequal power dynamics on marginalized communities, thereby not fully addressing the root causes of environmental issues. How can language limitations influence public understanding of environmental issues? Language limitations can result in misunderstandings or oversimplifications of environmental issues. This can influence public perception and hinder effective communication of the urgency and complexity of ecological challenges. What approaches can mitigate the effects of anthropocentrism in environmental discourse? Approaches such as ecocentric or biocentric perspectives can shift the focus away from human-centered views. Including the perspectives of indigenous communities and environmental ethicists can also provide a more balanced view. What strategies can enhance the political engagement of discourse analysis in environmental studies? Strategies include actively addressing the political contexts of environmental issues, critiquing power structures, and advocating for more equitable policies. Analysts should engage with political theories and apply them to environmental contexts. How can language be improved to better represent ecological realities? Language can be improved by incorporating more precise ecological terminology, using metaphors and analogies that better reflect ecological complexity, and ensuring that scientific insights are accurately translated into everyday language. What criticisms arise around simplifying environmental issues in discourse analysis? Simplifying environmental issues can lead to the neglect of key factors and relationships within ecosystems. This oversimplification can result in incomplete understandings that may influence ineffective or misguided policy decisions. How do the limitations of language affect cross-cultural communication in environmental discourse? Language limitations can cause misinterpretation and confusion, especially when translating environmental concepts across cultures. Different cultural understandings of nature and the environment can also affect how environmental issues are perceived and communicated. What role does discourse analysis play in addressing the controversy around anthropocentrism? Discourse analysis helps identify anthropocentric biases in language and narratives. By revealing these biases, it encourages more inclusive discourse that considers the broader ecological implications of environmental issues. In what ways can discourse analysts improve the political impact of their work on environmental issues? Analysts can improve the political impact by collaborating with policymakers, advocating for marginalized voices, and ensuring that their analyses are accessible and actionable for those involved in environmental policy and advocacy.